It's always broken. All right, it's fixed. We're streaming both to YouTube and Facebook. Happy Mother's Day. You got one job. Do you want to pick a incense or no?
I'm working.
So, Peyton didn't like my title today. Things my mother taught me after she lost her mind. Go ahead. What?
I did not like it.
Oh, I thought you were moaning about it. You said it
I'm
makes
always
it
moaning about
sound
it.
like my mother is crazy. My mother was not crazy. But those of you who know us know that the last 3 years of her life, we took care of her, and she had Alzheimer's. So she didn't lose her mind, but she lost her memory. And I feel so privileged to have, along with Wendy, who was really her main caretaker, participated in that, because I learned so much in those 3 years with my mom. And I'm sure it was unintended because she was battling this horrible disease, but there were blessings that came along with it. And so we want to talk about that next on Mother's Day, and maybe see if we cannot glean something of value from that right after this.
Pick the incense.
I'm supposed to pick the incense. It's over there.
Do this
I'll
one.
light the incense for it. Okay. Love spell. Uh-oh. And you're working with clay. No comment. No comment.
Okay.
So,
Dad, why did you drop it?
okay, put it in that thing. Peyton and I keep threatening to do a hell episode one day and have the smoke wafting past the screen. I'm going to put it over here, okay? So it doesn't waft.
Waft? Waft? It doesn't waft?
Well, it's wafting.
You sound like Larry David.
Larry David. I really don't want to sound like Larry David. So, Mother Mary, on Mother's Day, speaking words of wisdom, right? When I find myself in times of trouble. This isn't a time of trouble, but I want to share and glean just some thoughts about Mary's last few years. Now, my mom was a very serious person, and she was very particular. She had a code that she lived by. And Peyton, one of these codes was, and I'm just going to start out light, but one of these codes was she was all about gourmet, right? Everything in Mary's world was gourmet. Coffee, she was a harsh critic, man, and you could go to a restaurant and the food would be dynamite, but if the coffee afterwards was mediocre to bad, never again. We would never, ever go to that restaurant again. And so coffee had to be gourmet, and she would not eat, this is one of her things, it's part of the Mary Code, she never ate processed or what should I say, store-bought cookies or baked goods or anything. It had to be homemade. She never ate an Oreo in all the years I knew her until she lost her memory. So one of those things about Alzheimer's, you'll learn a lot if you become a caretaker of somebody with Alzheimer's. And I learned some harsh lessons, both Wendy and I did, because when you go back, when you're going through Alzheimer's, there's different stages, but at some point, you know, your close-up memory is going, but you remember your childhood. So Mom often thought that her mother was still alive and her brothers, and that she still lived on Ashland Avenue in Chicago, and she would try and get home. And she'd ask us, you know, when is she going home, and where's her mom? And one of the worst moments of my life, before I really actually knew what I was doing, taking care of my mother, was she asked where her mother was. And I made the horrific mistake of telling her the truth. that her mother had passed, what was it, 50 years ago, not realizing that in my mother's condition, she was just learning that her mother died. So I actually got to see my mom react to the horrific news that her mother was dead. It was awful. It was such a horrible experience. But then, luckily, because Alzheimer's, one of the blessings is, as horrific as that was for my mom for about 45 minutes, she forgot about it. I didn't forget about it. It still makes me cringe to this day. It still makes me, I have a remorse, a regret about it still to this day. But luckily, Mom forgot about it not long after that. But then I learned that when she asked for her dogs, who were dearly departed, I would just lie. Yeah, and this is why I think lying can be a beautiful thing in certain contexts. I would say, or tell the half-truth, and I'd say the dogs are with Nate. The dogs are with Nate, which is true. Nate had dogs at the time, but they weren't Mary's dogs. And so you have to kind of, when you're with somebody, you have to, who's suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, you have to realize your number one job. You have one job, as I like to say to Peyton, and it's not to light the incense. Your one job is to comfort them, to make them feel comfort. And because so much of their world is discomfort. They're confused. And so one of the big lessons, if you're going through this now, if you feel that it's upon you, one of the big things I need to tell you is don't answer their questions with the truth, especially when it's going to bring them great pain. Kind of divert the subject, or and if you have to, if you're in a corner, lie. But the other thing you learn is not to ask them questions, because the odds are they don't know. I used to ask my mom, how did you enjoy breakfast? 10 minutes after she had breakfast, she forgot what she had. 10 minutes. And so if you said something like, did you enjoy breakfast? She'd have this pained, quizzical look on her face. She didn't know how to answer. And so you realize, even though, and this is hard for Americans because we're so used to, or even people who are used to being kind, because part of being kind is asking people about themselves, right? Is asking questions. It's a great relational tool. And yet you have to switch gears when you're with somebody who's lost their memory, and asking them questions is actually quite cruel. So you don't want to do that. You might want to say, wasn't the omelet we had for breakfast today wonderful, or something like that, but you don't really want to go there. You don't really want to happen to that. But so I started with cookies. Mom always had homemade cookies either on the counter or in the freezer. She'd make a bunch and freeze them. She'd make her own candy, dark chocolate covered almonds. She'd make her own. Store-bought was no good. And so Mom always had homemade, period. Never, ever would try an Oreo. And one of the most pleasant memories I've ever had is seeing my mother eat an Oreo for the first time. Oh, I like that, Poe. Let me show the people what you're doing there. Although it's a black heart, that's a little... But I kind of like it. So I saw Mary eat an Oreo, and she loved it. And I was awestruck. I couldn't believe what was happening. And I said, Mom, those are store-bought. She goes, oh, they're so good. And she took another one. She enjoyed an Oreo. And then my life even grew more wonder-filled when she ate a Pop-Tart. Now, listen, I consumed a lot of Pop-Tarts and a lot of Oreos over the years in front of my mom, and she was never tempted, and she would never do it. She was a proper lady. And yet when she forgot about those restrictions she placed on herself, about the Mary Code, she found enjoyment out of things that she never would have tried prior. This is my first lesson. This was the first lesson I took from my mother after she lost at least her memory, was that we put up barriers sometimes that are not necessary, that box us in, that prevent us from experiencing life in the fullest. And sometimes we spend a whole lifetime living up to a code that doesn't allow for flourishing. And I know you think this is small, the delight of eating an Oreo or a Pop-Tart. But if you can expand that bigger, some people won't be open. I know when we lived in a very narrow world of evangelical Christianity, there were people. Now, I didn't want to go to Target even or Starbucks to have a coffee because I was banning people in my mind that didn't live up to my code. And it was Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I love Ben and Jerry's ice cream now, but I would never eat it then. But these kind of prescriptions, not going to Disney World, because you're on Team DeSantis or something foolish like that. So many things that we create for ourselves that prevent us. And sometimes they're not political things or religious or, like an Oreo or a Pop-Tart, but they're just unnecessary, right? We've grown up with them. We don't question them. It's a fence that we've put in our yard that we never really anticipate what life would be like without it. How much it would open up our life, and we allow these walls really to dictate our experience. And luckily for my mom, in the last few years, although the disease is horrible and it steals so much from you, it did open her up beyond her guarded presuppositions that she held until that moment. And it was a tremendous lesson for me to be more flexible with those things, with boundaries that are unnecessary. That was the first thing, and it's something that's really stuck with me, and I test myself with it quite often. I'll ask myself, am I saying no to this experience? Am I saying no to this author or this film because I have some unnecessary bias that I've carried with me from my past life, right? And if you grew up in the evangelical world, you know a lot of people like this. They don't like Alec Baldwin's politics, and so they can't appreciate him and how he steals the movie in Glengarry Glen Ross. They can't separate the art from the artist. And so if the artist doesn't vote like them, or for some reason they don't like the cut of his jib, they just throw him on the trash heap. And what you do is you steal from yourself your own joy, your own appreciation of the true and the good and the beautiful. Because Alec Baldwin is a hell of an actor. So is Sean Penn. For years, I wouldn't, people would mention Sean Penn, and other than Spicoli, I wouldn't give him any credit because he got too political, and I couldn't separate the art from the artist. So, Mother Mary taught me that after she lost her memory. Maybe in this instance, I'm an Oreoist or a Pop-Tartist, that I have a prejudice that I'm carrying against something that's unnecessary and that's holding back my education, my entertainment, the flourishing of my own life. That's the first lesson, and I know it seems simple, but that was a really powerful lesson. Another thing that happened, and Poe wasn't there. Well, you might have been there for this, but you were too young to remember it. When you're taking care of somebody in that condition, you really can't leave them alone, right? They might walk out into the street, or they have to be kind of, if you're their caretaker. And Wendy and I, for 3 years, we passed the baton to each other. I remember during this period of time, Poe, you'll find this curious because we just watched some of the movies that came out during this period of time, but even if a movie came out that we wanted to see together, we didn't really have a date for like 3 years, unless we took Mary on it. But The Passion of the Christ came out, and I went with the church group to see it, and I was really moved. I couldn't believe how good it was, and I went home, and I'm like, Tag, you're it, to Wendy. I'm like, you got to go see it right now. I got Mary and the kids. You go right now. And I forced her to get in the car and to go by her. And she saw the movie by herself. The poor thing. I think she was in awe. She came home. She was in awe. And I think she kind of resented that she was by herself and didn't get to share that with me or with others and that experience, because that's a rough watch. But for 3 years, we didn't have a date. We'd switch off. So when we'd go somewhere together as a family, Mary was usually with us when she could travel, and we had to get something for the boys at like one of these sporting goods stores, Bass Pro Shop, I think it was, and so we got in the car and we drove to Bass Pro Shop, and Mary was sitting in the back with, I think, Connor and Carter, and Wendy and I got out of the car when we pull into the parking lot, and we come around to the door where Mary is, and I open the door, and out comes Mary. And my mother was very proper, and she was very serious when it came to what she wore and how she conducted herself, her demeanor. And so she got out of this car. You know the story, right? She got out of this car like she wasn't going to Bass Pro Shop. She was going to testify in front of the UN or something. This is how my mother carried herself, right? Always very serious. She, don't get me wrong, she could laugh, but her typical demeanor was very serious, very austere. She got out of this car, and I think she had her mink coat on because it was cold. It's Chicago. And she had found in the back pocket of my Jeep Cherokee a pair of Connor and Carter's sunglasses. Now they were kids. They were, 8 and 6, I think, at the time. And Connor had these glasses. They both did, but I think they were Connor's pair. Connor had these glasses. They were kind of like John Lennon shaped. They were round, but they were holographic. They had holographic lenses. And when you looked at them, you were looking at the eyes of a dinosaur, like a raptor eyes or something like that. They were either the raptor eyes or they're the ones that had the skulls, that had like the glow-in-the-dark skulls in it. And I wasn't prepared for this, so I opened the door, and out comes my mom, regal like Queen Elizabeth, wearing raptor eyes and not knowing how ridiculous it looked. And I fell back almost like the temple guard in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus said, I am. I literally almost fell on the ground, not laughing at her, but laughing at the situation. And she looked at me like, what is wrong with this guy? You know what? And how she felt. I know she felt she looked great. And so we didn't make her take the glasses off. We let her wear the Raptor glasses, and the boys were having a laugh, and Wendy and I, but it was just something Mom would never wear, not even as a joke. If you said, Mom, try these on, she would not wear them, but she was wearing Raptor glasses. So this is the main lesson with Mom. But I don't have a lot of time left, Poe. I'm going to close early because we're taking your mom to brunch. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I want to close with this. For 3 years, I put my mom to bed every night. And sometimes in those 3 years, I'd have to carry her to bed. And luckily, she was, a light person. But every night when I'd put her to bed. Now, my mom's old school Assyrian, right? Old country Assyrian, and the Assyrians, you ever see how in France they greet each other, or Europe they greet each other with like 2 kisses, a kiss on each cheek? The Assyrians do it one better. It's 3 kisses. If you're really accepted, if you're really loved, if you're part of the inner circle, you get 3 kisses. You get kiss, kiss, kiss. It's almost like the Catholic, doing the cross symbol. You'll get 3 kisses. Mom didn't, she was stingy with this. Very few people would get the 3 kisses. Family. Outside of family, maybe a handful of people would get the triple kiss from my mother, which meant a lot. So every night when I'd put her to bed, even at the point she forgot who I was, and she didn't realize I was her son. There was a period of time where I was still John, but I was her brother John, right? And she'd be talking to me as if I was her brother John, my Uncle John. And then when she forgot that, the very last thing, I was her doctor or her nurse, because I was caring for her. She thought I was a doctor or a nurse. And even at that point, she'd always give me the triple kiss. There was something in her that she knew, this guy loves me, right? And I love him. And every night I'd put her to bed and I'd bring the covers up and she'd give me the triple kiss, and I'd say to her, every night I'd say to her, Mom, tomorrow is going to be a great day. We're going to have a great cup of coffee in the morning and a great breakfast. Good night. I'll see you then. Now, I told you that the worst thing you can do with people with memory loss, dementia, Alzheimer's, is ask them questions. Sometimes I'd slip, and when I'd ask my mom a question, I'd really want to hit myself because I'd see the pain in her face, as she'd struggle to remember, the confusion, the awkwardness. Right away I'd try and recover and change the subject or something. But there was one night, and I did this every night for 3 years. There was one night I put her down, I got the triple kiss, and before I could think about it, I said to her, Mom, do you know what we're going to do tomorrow? And the moment I said it, I regretted it. When you say the same thing every night, you kind of think she's going to say back to you, we're going to have a great cup of coffee and a good breakfast. And she looked at me, and normally when I'd ask her a question, there'd be pain. There'd be confusion in her face. She'd struggle with it. And what struck me this time, and I'll never forget it, I said, Mom, do you know what we're going to do tomorrow? And without pain, without confusion, she smiled and she said, sure, we're going to serve the Lord. The last thing my mother ever forgot, believe it or not, there were 2 things. You're going to love this. Was her love of the Lord and the joy in her heart to serve Him. I've said many times, I think I've only met one Christian in my life, my mother. And her love of coffee. Unfortunately, she forgot her family at the end. She forgot even her dogs. But she never forgot her love of coffee until the last few days when she was incoherent and pretty much asleep. Her love of coffee and her love of the Lord were my 2 takeaways from my mother at the end. And that, what could have been a horrible memory for me because I put her in a spot that might have made her uncomfortable right before she goes to bed. What a horrible time to do it. But the reason that's such a blessed memory is it was my mom. Everything had been stripped away from her but that. She had lost so much of what she had adored. And that, the hard thing about Alzheimer's is when it first started, such a horrible disease. When it first started, my mom was still pretty lucid. And she realized she's losing her memory and pretty fast. And the worst part about Alzheimer's for the patient is not when you're, stage 2, stage 3 or whatever, you worked your way and most of it's gone already. But when you stand on the precipice and you still know who you are, and you know who your children are and your husband is, and you still have all of this, and you see it slipping away, and you know that in short time you're going to forget all of what makes you you. At least that's how some people see it. I don't see it that way. My mom was still my mom, even when her memory banks were gone. And I remember how much joy we had together, even though she didn't know I was her son or Wendy was her daughter-in-law. We'd put on an old Shirley Temple movie, and we'd sit with her on the couch and just give her comfort. And she loved the presence of our children. She loved Carter, would bring her breakfast every morning. Carter would bring in the coffee and the toast, usually with peach jelly or English muffin. And she loved Peyton. The last year, Peyton would crawl up onto her bed when we'd wake up Mary, and she'd spend some time with Peyton. But she just loved watching our kids, and she loved, the old movies. And she really enjoyed the last period of her life, even though she'd forgotten so much. And yet there was so much that I learned from my mother in those last 3 years. If I could give you anything, it was just that appreciation I had, that her real attitude about her faith was legit. It was absolutely legit. My mother and I, my wife, your mother, and I just listened to an interview on recovering evangelicals with Frankie Schaefer. And he was talking about when he first noticed trouble in paradise. He grew up in this evangelical super family, right? Francis and Edith Schaefer. And he saw how much they loved the people that were at L'Abri and the drug addicts they were helping, people, how good they treat people that many Christians wouldn't treat well, including, homosexuals, other people who were maybe struggling with the faith and so forth, and how his mother would care for a drug addict who had just thrown up at 2 a.m. and so forth. And the first disconnect for Frankie Schaefer with the evangelical movement came when he came to America, and he saw how the sausage was made in the evangelical machinery. He met Jerry Falwells and the Dr. Dobsons and the Pat Robertsons, and he saw this huge divide between his parents, who really reflected the love of Christ, and this machinery that was evangelicalism in America, that was politically driven and cold and judgmental and hypocritical. And that was the first challenge to his faith. And I said, Wendy and I went through something similar like that. But to see everything stripped from my mother, but this legitimate love of her Lord. And that was reflected, I think, to everyone who knew Mary. So on this Mother's Day, I know some people struggle with it, but I don't. Not just because I had a wonderful mother, my wife's a wonderful mother, but because I would say, and I say this oftentimes to people who didn't have a good father or a good mother and they struggle on Mother's Day and Father's Day, understand that it might be your personal struggle, and I get it, but don't try and take it away from others. I see a lot of ranting lately, even in former evangelical circles, about how like Mother's Day is somehow wrong or corrupt, or like Valentine's Day. Look, no, even if you didn't have a good mother, you can appreciate the idea that there are good mothers out there. And to have a good mother or to be a good mother is revolutionary. It's probably going to be the greatest influence on the children, period. And I know my mother has been my greatest influence. Now my wife and children are, but my mother, again, I still reflect on the lessons that she taught me and that I learned from her, even when she didn't realize she was teaching me a lesson. So I don't know if I'll have a Oreo or a Pop-Tart today. Maybe we should have one just in memory of Mother Mary. But I would just say to you, And this is one thing that I think we fail at often, is just how many times that the love of God is expressed not just as a father but as a mother in the Word. There's real true meaning there. If you really want a picture of unconditional love, oftentimes it's found in the figure of a mother loving a child. And this is the love that God is trying to get across to us. And oftentimes in pictures. So even if you didn't have a great mother, I think you can appreciate the fact that you've seen your friends who've had a great mother, and that doesn't diminish the fact that there are great mothers out there. Even if you've known none among your friends, there are in literature. There are mothers in literature you could look to and say, yeah, I want to love like that. Anyway, I'm done. What do you got? You want the big screen? You want this one? Or that?
This is part that says mom.
Oh, hold on. Go ahead. Is that your heart?
No.
Oh, good, because it's like murky.
That's probably what my heart looks like. And then this is a ring box.
A ring box?
You put a ring in it.
Oh, nice. Do these have to like set up and dry, or? Yeah?
Pretty dry.
They're pretty dry.
I don't know.
Forming clay. Pays
Got-
black heart and love for her mother. And your hands are filthy. Now we're going to brunch. Have a wonderful Mother's Day, everybody. See you next time.